Every year for Advent and Christmas, we go back to the so-called Infancy Narratives. We find them only in two Gospels, Matthew and Luke, the first two chapters of each. Let us explore together the use we make of them and implicit assumptions we often make when doing so. The way we tend to use these narratives liturgically is certainly for our meditation, but it is also our way to find historical events on which to base our faith. We want to base our faith and the graces God wants to give us during Advent and during Christmas on historical facts and accounts. We can fairly say that this is one of the main reasons why we have recourse to the infancy narratives. Christmas wouldn't be Christmas without them. Both Matthew's account of the infancy narratives and Luke's one are used by the liturgy of the Mass as daily readings, especially the closer we draw to Christmas Day. Both are important, but each one of the authors, Matthew and Luke, has his own perspective, plan, and goal. We often extract a text from its context and use it as a gospel during Mass, and we forget the aim of the author. In fact, we tend to reduce the text to a historical source rather than dive in the theology of the author. What strikes us particularly during this season is the amount of information we draw from the first two chapters of St. Luke, and to which extent they play a fundamental role during Advent and Christmastide. Think, for instance, the Annunciation to Zechariah, the Annunciation to Mary, the Visitation, the Magnificat, the birth of John the Baptist, the Benedictus, Jesus' birth, the angels appearing to the shepherds, and the shepherds visiting Mary and Joseph, and so forth. Imagine just for a second that for a mysterious reason we would have had only three Gospels, excluding Luke. Imagine what we would lose. But still, our use tends to be historical and at best meditative. In fact, we often read the first 4 verses of St. Luke's Gospel as a declaration made by a historian, not necessarily by one of the greatest geniuses of Christianity. In verse 3 of his first chapter, Luke says that he intends to offer an orderly account, verse 3, which seems to reinforce this unshakable belief that he is first and foremost a historian of Christianity. Often we are not aware of the many issues regarding Luke's Gospel, the text, the different layers of composition of his text, the reason of the modifications he brought to the text, what is his real theological aim, and so forth. On top of that, because of the book of the Acts of the Apostle, of whom Luke is also the author, because of the place Luke dedicates to St. Paul in his book, half of the book, we tend to think that Luke is Paul's disciple. In this sense, we consider that theologically, St. Paul is the master and Luke the disciple, the one who copied from the master. We don't expect something hugely relevant theologically to stick out from Luke compared to the greatness of St. Paul. Luke often stays well under the shadow of St. Paul. We need also to add the fact that Luke is usually classified as a synoptical gospel, which means that he is part of a group which follows the same structure roughly or plan, Matthew and Mark. In doing this, we don't allow ourselves mentally to notice the genius and uniqueness of St. Luke's Gospel. The above are often implicit spontaneous assumptions, made without any hesitation. We know them, we are certain of them, simply because it seems obvious. Despite this very long tradition, where St. Paul's greatness can't be compared with Luke's one, despite the effort of many biblical scholars and theologians to show the uniqueness of Luke, of his intent, of his gospel, despite the material facts in St. Luke's gospel, which raise many unanswered questions, we continue to function with Luke in this mode. In fact, when you ask who are the greatest geniuses of the New Testament, the majority of the believers and scholars will reply St. John and St. Paul.